Well, here we are at another session of MindYourHealthcast.com. As you know, we've been dancing through some very interesting, sometimes usual, sometimes unusual, sometimes you wonder what material. And we are always working to expand your thinking and to open your eyes and to erase away the blind spots and get rid of the tunnel vision and think for yourself and make your own decisions and don't be part of the herd of sheep that runs together right over the edge of the cliff. We want you to find out what you need to know to run your life and your health and do it with the capability of analyzing what's being presented and what you think about it and making your final decision. You know, many years ago in Texas, they were trying to put in a law to license acupuncture because the medical people in Texas were against it being available. And so there were a lot of citizens in Texas who wanted it, and so eventually they brought a suit, I think, against the state and potentially maybe the medical people also. Well, anyhow, it was in federal court, and it came to a trial period. And so a judge in the federal court ruled that, you know, this is America. So I hope it still is. And that these things that everybody might not see eye to eye on, but have some legitimacy because it's being done around the world and has been done for thousands of years, that people kind of have rights, like if they would like to have it, that's their right to do that. And according to our system, if and when it's working right, this judge said, you know, we have the right to make our own decisions related to our own bodies, and we have the right to be wrong, to make a bad decision. But at least it's our decision. It's not being forced on us by somebody else. So if it comes out bad, then, of course, we took the responsibility. We did it, and then we live with it. But not so good if somebody else forces you to do something different, which you didn't want to do, and it comes out bad, and you're stuck with it. And you didn't want it in the first place. So we want you to be able to do that when it comes to all kind of health decisions. And so it brings us to another level, which I've mentioned on and off along the way, but I thought I would kind of concentrate at this time so that you would have some idea of what options are in terms of the mind and the emotions. And of course, in particular, we're going to be talking about a system called Evox, E-V-O-X, and it has to do with a system of neutralizing the negative energies associated with certain events and memories in our life that impair our ability to function properly. Or at least the way we'd like to function. I mean, it doesn't have to be like everybody else wants you to function, but at least like you would want to function. And so, the first time I solved the system, I was intrigued and felt it to myself. I said, I need to have this. And it wasn't originally called Evox, it was originally called Vocal 360, being, first of all, that it involved your voice, and in a sense, analyzing your voice and creating a 360-degree wheel divided into 12 sections of different emotional type issues. Now, the whole system of psychology and psychiatry has changed tremendously. I have an extensive background in psychology, counseling, psychotherapy, crisis intervention, etc., and training in psychoactive drugs. And I studied at a very high-level institute in Cleveland many years ago. It was called Cleveland Psychiatric Institute, and it's a teaching psychiatric hospital, and it's interconnected, or at least it was at the time. It was located physically, connected by tunnel to a county hospital, like a general hospital. And then it also had an affiliation with Case Western University School of Medicine Department of Psychiatry. So I got into this 2-year program, and it involved all different aspects of psychiatry, including group therapy. And in order to learn group therapy, you had to participate in an ongoing group for a period of 2 years. And it was an interesting experience. I had known about group therapy and actually had done some group work before that program. But it was a good experience. I got to meet a lot of top-notch people in the field of psychiatry and psychotherapy. Dr. Irving Rosen, who wrote a lot of journal articles and who was the resident expert on schizophrenia and had developed a methodology to work with it called the Anaclytic Approach that got people well. In fact, it was interesting because when he first came to Cleveland, they made him head of the therapy at Cleveland State Mental Hospital. Now, they specialized there in schizophrenia, and they had a community of about 500 plus or minus people all the time. So they would help somebody and they would get out for a while, but then they would come bouncing back. And so in the meantime, somebody else would be getting out, and then they would come bouncing back. But in the rotation, on the average, there was around 500 people there. And this had been going that way for several years. So Dr. Rosen came in, and he instituted this Anaclytic approach to schizophrenia, which we're not going to have time to get into in any detail. And it's not part of what I want to tell you. Anyhow, but in about a year or two, he reduced the community from 500 down to less than 20. And they weren't bouncing back. And so consequently, they decided to close down the facility and move him and the few remaining people over to Cleveland Psychiatric Institute, which was a teaching psychiatric organization. And so he became head of therapy training, especially for schizophrenic treatment. And so it was fortunate that I met him and was in contact with him. And he was an innovative guy. And of course, now we're talking about a period of time before the psychiatric drugs. During the time I was there, there were a few had been introduced, but not a lot. And they still were doing psychotherapy at that time. And the mental handbook, the diagnostic manual for mental, well, back then they called it mental and emotional disorders. They've kind of changed things a lot. But it was version 2, and the title of it was actually a diagnostic and statistical manual of psychological and mental and emotional disorders. And while I was in the 2-year program, they came out with a new version 3, and they changed it. They dropped off the mental and emotional disorders, and it was called the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. And the reason being that as some of these psychiatric drugs were starting to come out, there needed to be a market for them, and so they were starting to say that the psychological emotional issues were because of biochemical upsets in the brain, and therefore we needed to use these drugs to manage those. Now notice I said manage, not cure. Cure was never a part of the program. The program was just to make people manageable so that they either could go back out in society and function, or they could be manageable in a hospital setting. And so the transition was underway at that point. And from that, it moved into, as I say, to psychoactive drug therapy or psychotropic compounds. And everything changed after that, and I've watched a tremendous change. And we don't have time to talk again with all the implications of the whole thing, and there are a lot. The brain is a touchy system, and interestingly, as I mentioned just recently, they did not even know the full brain or the full function of the brain. They thought they already had their foot heavily in the door when they discovered the neurons and so forth. And so they decided that the neurons, or some researcher decided actually, and it just got passed on, that the neurons were the functional part of the brain, and therefore they studied neurons and the effects of drugs on neurons. But of course now, as I say, they already have discovered that there's 90% of the brain that are non-neurons that they thought had nothing to do with the thought processes and functioning, that they were more protective and supportive and so forth of the neurons. And that was the glial cells. And so now they're just finding out something about a more complete study of the brain. But it's like starting from ground zero almost, because they didn't bother. And I told you just recently that discovering in Einstein's brain that his brain actually size-wise was smaller than average, which was a big shock, because they anticipated this mental giant must have had a big brain, and he didn't. It was smaller. But what they did discover was that he had a huge amount more of glial cells than the average brain. And that was one of the things that kind of opened the door to a better study of the glial cells. But that's not our purpose anyhow. Within all this, there are certain structures of the brain that have to do with memory and emotions, which is called the limbic system. And the limbic system primarily, as far as we're concerned, consists of the amygdala and the hippocampus. And so that is the part that when you hear something and it brings up a memory, if there's a strong emotional component tied to that memory, it becomes liberated also. Now, sometimes that emotional component is so disruptive and so disturbing because when it originally occurred, it was a very traumatic experience, and sometimes so traumatic that the brain automatically stores it away and refuses to remember it, which is called repression, or that you, at some period right after that, decide to store it away and not remember it, which is suppression. It's sitting in the background, and it's actually trying to be expressed and resolved. It's like you put it away unbalanced, and it wants to be balanced. So it's continually going to nudge you by various ways to tell you that you really need to deal with this. And at the same time, there's another part of your conscious psyche that wants to protect you, that says, "Oh, it's much too painful. I can't tolerate it." And so you have this conflict going on. It's trying to get out, and you're trying to hold it back. Now, to study Gestalt psychology gives you a better idea of this, because it has to do with what is pressing for your attention. If you get hungry, the hunger in your body keeps saying, "You got to eat, you got to eat, you got to eat," and you say, "Well, no, but I got to do this first." So instead of satisfying that, we consciously push it aside for a while, but that's only temporary. But it keeps coming back and saying, "Hey, you got to eat, you got to eat. Your body needs more nutrients." And so that comes back trying to grab your attention until it's somehow laid to rest, meaning you eat or you die or whatever. It's laid to rest. So that is called Gestalt, which is the foreground, the thing that's grabbing your immediate attention, versus everything else in the background. And it's that constant movement of foreground to background that's called the gestalt, or configuration of the psyche. And so they developed a whole field of study out of Germany, and that's where the term gestalt comes from, which means a configuration, or a configuration. And so this is constantly going on all the time, you know. You've eaten and you think, okay, now I can get on with what I want to do, and then all of a sudden your bladder says, you need to go to the restroom. And you say, well, I know, but I got to get this done first. So you push it aside, but it keeps knocking. Yoo-hoo, I'm still here. You need to go to the potty. And so that gets your attention until you satisfy it. Once it's satisfied, it's off in the background, and something else comes to the foreground. So this freedom of movement and stress and resolution of the stress, somehow you're resolving it. That's the way our brains function about a lot of things. And so the ones that we push back and we don't want to deal with, whether we did it consciously or unconsciously, they're sitting in the background, but they're still wanting to be resolved. So they keep pressing to get out. The harder they press to get out, the harder the suppressing forces or repressing forces are to hold it back. Now, guess what? That takes lots of energy. So it begins to affect you. And if after a while certain parts of the brain are affected, and this is getting into German new medicine, we don't even have time to get into that at all, but it can start to affect some part of your body. Okay, and eventually now you've got other problems. And of course the worst of the worst is, in my mind, is to develop cancer. And that was the work of Dr. All of a sudden he went right out of my head, out of Germany, the German new medicine, Hammer, Dr. Hammer. And that's another ball game, and we've talked about it a little bit before in some of the cancer stuff. But I'm saying all this to say that everybody has these issues, some worse than others, some more traumatic than others, some more powerful, and hence requiring more of your body energy to hold it back. Now, all that energy that's being taken to hold it back is taking away from the other things that your body needs to do, because everything requires energy. You know, we're an energy person. We have to have energy. That's why all the cells have these little mitochondrial units that are pumping out energy molecules all the time to be able to cause things to happen in the body. So if we're utilizing a lot of our energy to repress this material, we can't function to our best. And sometimes it, as I say, it begins to affect us physically tremendously. It runs our blood pressure up maybe. It causes us to be sick all the time. It depresses our immune system. I mean, all these things start to happen as a result of that. Okay, so now, from way back, first of all, we had the medicine, and then we had these a group of people in medicine, and I'm using it very generically to mean any type of helping of people. So they developed some systems of looking at the way things work. Now, as always, we have this dichotomy. You've got the materialists, and you've got the vitalists, in a sense, the people that think about there being some basic vital energy that is in the body, and therefore we have to understand it, and we have to learn how to deal with it and allow it to be free so it can do what it needs to do. And whereas the materialists say, you know, we're a box of pieces and a box of reflexes, and so we deal with stuff by just reconditioning these reflexes. And so out of that developed behavioristic concepts versus the dynamic concepts that, again, getting back to this vitalistic idea. Well, of course, it finally got to the point that nobody understood. We're talking like 1800s, 17, 1800s, people with strong emotional issues that were not functioning well. Finally got to the point that said, well, these people have brain fever, and if they have brain fever, it's incurable because we can't do a thing for the brain, so the only thing to do is put them in chains and put them in a dungeon and leave them there and maltreat them like crazy because they're nothing but a mindless beast. And so, if you want to kick them around or you want to deprive them, whatever you want to do, it's okay, because they don't know anyhow, because the brain fever's destroyed their brain till there's nothing can be done. So that was the condition when Sigmund Freud came along. And, I don't necessarily agree with everything he did, but I have to say that one of the things he did do is he began a serious look at emotional issues and the psyche and so forth. And he really was not a clinician to treat people. He was a researcher. Out of what he did, a school of treatment and analysis came, called psychoanalysis, and psychiatry kind of came out of that. And but he got people thinking. These people aren't incurable, burned out brain people, and so you just have to somehow kind of maintain them till they die. But they are people with issues, and that those issues may not consciously be known, but they're there. And he came along with this idea of the unconscious and how it affects people. So I think Freud did a tremendous amount to liberate emotional, mental problems from barbarity treatment to saying, okay, these are humans and they have problems, and sometimes the problems have become overwhelming, and so we want to know what to do to take care of those. And out of that grew a lot of study. But at the same time, there were some other people, going all the way back to Pavlov and his salivating dogs. I'm sure you remember that. He would take dogs and he would show them food, and they would begin to salivate. And then he would feed them. And he did that for a while, kind of studying how this reaction occurred. And then one day he thought, well, when I show them a food, I'm also going to ring a bell. And so he rang the bell as he showed them the food, and the dog salivated. And over a period of time, he found that if he did not show them the food, but he just rang the bell, they began to salivate. And so he considered that a conditioned reflex. In other words, we have added a new alteration to the way the dog naturally reflexes when it sees food. So at the ringing of a bell, he could initiate the salivation, even though the dog wasn't seeing any food. A new association had developed in the brain. And so there were some therapists who picked up on that, like Watson and later Skinner, two different approaches to the idea. But their feeling was, Watson, the main nerves, what's going on in the head. Everything is reflexes. We're a material body, and we're made up of a bunch of pieces. And getting back to the Newtonian that we did just talk about recently, and so because of that, all we have to do is to recondition the person to respond differently. And so they started a whole system of treatment of conditioned reflex therapy, and there's a lot of material came out on that. And so the idea was that you make a new association with the same response, or you extinguish it by changing. And so they developed a school of therapy, and it was called behavioral concept. And the people who followed the ideas of Freud said these are mental conflicts and emotional things going on, and what we have to do is to get to the cause, what was the original things that went on. So hence the term psychoanalysis. And so it developed into a very, very extensive system. But here was the paradox. You had certain schools who the head of the psychology department were behavioristic in mindset. They believed it's all matter of reflexes. And then you had the other school who says it's unconscious conflicts. The dynamic. We got all these conflicts going on, and they affect the way our body functions and the way we're able to function as a person in society. And so we have to get to the core of these conflicts, uncover them, and help the person integrate and discharge that conflict energy. See, they realized there was some kind of an energy tied to it. And so we got to discharge that, get rid of it, and in fact, abreaction, abreaction is, I'm sorry, I said it wrong. Abreaction is the term that means you have them act out and feel these feelings and discharge them. So that was a way of discharging. So anyhow, so growing up and going to college and deciding you're going to be a psychologist, and so you go to this school, you come out a behaviorist. If you go to this school, you come out an analytical or a dynamic psychologist. And so we started immediately with two different, very contradictory approaches if you only take that in in consideration. This is it. So they didn't agree with each other. And many times people doing that, young people coming up, they didn't know the other, unless they got introduced to the other side, they didn't even know about it, because obviously all the books and material that's going to be presented by behaviorists are going to be from behaviorist thinking psychiatrists or psychologists and researchers. And if you go to the other side, the dynamic or analytical side, that's the material you're going to get exposed to. And so we developed these two big schools, going, in a sense, two different directions, when in fact it's crazy because both are true, but not exclusively true. In other words, it's true that the unconscious conflicts are problematic, and it's also true that you can condition a person in many areas, not always all areas, but in many areas you can condition a person to alter their behavior. And the whole idea of mind-body is what we're talking about, was the integrated way of looking at it. But, I mean, these people were pretty hard, what I call hard shell. You know, once they're really grounded in it, they can find all kind of anecdotal or otherwise material to verify their position. And once you've done that, it's easy over your life to keep, with your tunnel vision, only seeing those things that verify what you believe to be true. And it's hard to get objectivity within any realm, anyhow, because of the tunnel vision. Now that, remember, we talked a lot about that, about mind filters. And now I'm just carrying it forward more into the psychological. And I'm doing all this to get to the point that a newer way of dealing with all this, that those philosophies lose their significance in terms of saying, well, this is the way it has to be, and the other guy say, knowing it, this is the way it has to be. And as I say, both right to a degree, that both are important. And so there's, over the years, all these therapies developed, and ideas developed, and I think as I got into the field of psychotherapy, I probably have studied about every methodology or system that there is related to it. And I know when I was in the program, I constantly went to the library at the school and was digging out all these other guys along the way, names that you don't hear, but at different points in the process, these names came to the foreground. And, you know, they lasted for a while, and they gathered a group of people, and then they kind of moved off to the side. But pretty much all of them, to some degree, went heavily one way or the other in terms of behavioristic versus dynamic. And one of the big innovators who came along in this whole process that was contemporary with Freud, I think was, he was brilliant, he was a genius, but you know, a lot of people thought he was way out or whatever, but he was an investigator, and he began to clear himself so that he looked at all kinds of directions, he didn't take what was the accepted way of thinking, and that was Dr. Wilhelm Reich. Now, I mentioned about him on and off, I've mentioned several times, because he was involved in a lot of things. But he understood body energetics. And so he developed a type of therapy called orgone therapy. And I guess the best definition of orgone means organic energy, which is, again, what we're talking about, body energetics. And he realized this mind-body connection early, way back, as I say. He and Freud had discussion, but Freud was heavily into this analytical mode. And talk it out, get into the psyche, bring it to the foreground, and so he got into dream analysis and so forth. And so he said, when you have emotions that are stored up, that are either repressed or suppressed, that you defend against letting that out because you potentially considered it to be too painful to deal with, and so even though it happened in early childhood, you've now grown up, a part of your mind still is fearful of it coming out because they're still seeing it as it was when you were a child and it occurred. And so it becomes a big problem. It begins to overflow into your life. It begins to drain your energy. You begin to sometimes develop obsessions because sometimes you can trigger a part of the brain, the cingulate gyrus, which is like the gerbil wheel, keeps spinning and spinning once you initiate it, out of which obsessive compulsive issues come, and so forth. And so it depends on the direction it takes in your system, what kind of symptomatology you're going to have. But in anyhow, he said it's a defensive maneuver so that you can continue to function. Okay, so he said, after a lot of investigation, that your body engages the physical musculature to become part of the defense. And therefore, if you're going to have a meaningful therapy, you have to break the physical tensions as well as get to the psychological, emotional issue too. And many times, if you don't break the physical structuring, he called it armoring, then you're not going to let it loose because it's a very powerful defensive network. And it's protecting you. I mean, at least that's what you're thinking, because when you did it, it was a protective maneuver. And so, even though it happened way back then in your psyche, it's still a protective maneuver. And so he said you have to do things to break these physical rings. And so he said there's 7 bands of armoring of muscles that go around your body all the way from the head down to the pelvis. And that when this constriction occurs, you can develop physical problems related to that because you have chronic tension in that muscular band, and therefore it affects the free movement of energy through your body, which is what happens when you're healthy and uninhibited with all these problems. And so his approach was both physical as well as psychological. Now, if you want to get an inkling of it, I mentioned a little bit before about bioenergetics, and Alexander Lowen, one of the students, and Ellsworth Baker out of New York, who was another one of the students. And Ellsworth Baker, he retained the concept orgone and called it orgone therapy. And Dr. Alexander Lowen liked a term that people could relate to better because there was a lot more coming out about body energies, acupuncture, and all kinds of things. And people were becoming a little bit more familiar with this energy concept. And so he called it bioenergetics, or biological energy, and people could relate to that better than orgone. But in any case, Baker spent his life doing therapy, utilizing the term orgone therapy, and helped many people get well. And I did mention it earlier, I don't know if you made a note of it, but Orson Bean, who was in entertaining field and well known at one time, had gone to a Freudian analyst for several years, maybe 10 years, and spent a fortune in money of the day. And at the end of the 10 years or whatever it was he went to psychoanalysis, he walked away feeling as bad and problematic as when he went. And so he'd gained a lot of insights about a lot of things, but he still had his problems. So anyhow, somehow he got connected with Ellsworth Baker in New York and orgone therapy. And so he went there and went through the program. Well, in a short period of time, he was able to break through and shake a bunch of bad stuff from his background. And he felt like a new person. He had more energy. He wasn't depressed like he was before. And he was really excited about it. So he wrote a book called Me and the Orgone. And Orson Bean is his name. So if you look, I haven't looked recently. It's generally been available, if not as a new book, as a used book. I'm sure it hasn't been republished. But it started him on a whole new life, actually. And it changed his direction. And I'm not going to get into all that because we're already running out of time. So it does appear this is going to be a two-part discussion, because there's several things that we need to bring together for all this to make sense. And I'm laying some background. So that's some of the early history up to this point of how the field of psychology, psychiatry has developed. Now, along came different people, as I said, and developed different systems. But I'm convinced, apart from what I'm going to finally get to, that probably the bioenergetic people understood both the physical and emotional side, and utilizing a lot of the stuff that Reich developed, they were able to help a lot of people, and have. Stanley Kellerman is a psychologist who got into the whole idea of bioenergetics instead of orgone. He liked the term bioenergetics from Lowen. And there was another doctor by the name of, a Greek doctor, a physician by the name of Pyrrhakos, and he's carried it off a little bit different direction in the energy side also. But Lowen's got a lot of books out and gives you a pretty good understanding of the impact on your body of suppressed things and how they physically affect you. And if you want to think about it, I mentioned this before, but reinforcing is good. That's what I learned a long time ago, because when I do all these seminars and go back, people I know have been exposed to this stuff and they look at you like it's brand new material. It's because it just didn't connect the first time. I mean, there's so much that you have to do a rethink about that sometimes you just can't get it all together, and it bears repeating. It did for me. I mean, I heard it and it fell on deaf ears, a lot of it at the beginning, and it takes a lot of integration and a lot of opening to get into clarifying your vision so you can see clearer and get rid of those mind filters, the deletions, the distortions, and the generalizations. So anyhow, this freeing up this energy that gets set in there, and I was going to give you an example. If you're a child and you do something and your parent scolds you or punishes you in some way, and you start to cry, and there's some parents that's not allowed, so they said, stop crying or you're going to get more. And so how does the child hold back the crying? Well, one is they set their jaw, and that tightens a band of muscles around. They constrict their throat so they don't make a lot of noise, and that is another band of muscles that get contracted, and they control their breathing so that instead of sobbing, they have to control how they breathe in and out. That sets another. So there's at least 3 sets or bands of muscles that get set or armored. And so as a Reichian therapist or a bioenergetic therapist, you look for the bands of armor. In other words, you examine the physical body and say, wow, and you ask a lot of questions about their symptoms. And you can see, what people say, well, I always feel like my throat's constricted, and it feels like I have trouble swallowing. And that's why, because that's how you kept from crying when you were a child, and it became a chronic issue. And so all the other emotional things that were tied to that gets locked in or held back too. So in bioenergetic therapy or Reichian therapy, you start, first of all, opening up the breathing and break some of this armoring of the chest and the throat, because they have you lay with your head over a rolled towel or lay back over a stool with a rolled towel and drops your head back, forces your mouth to open, and forces you to start to breathe through your mouth. Well, in order to do that, the throat has to open. So you begin to bit by bit open these banded areas, and so it's a process, but much faster than analytical or regular psychotherapy. When we get down to Evox, we're going to be talking that you can do something in about 4 to 6 weeks that would take probably 3 to 5 years under any kind of normal psychotherapy, and of course with drug therapy would never happen, because all it does is try to manage the chemistry of the brain without solving any of the problems, and that ain't good. I hate to say, not good. And we'll get in a little bit as to why that's true. So I hope I'm kind of giving you an opening to this whole idea of the psyche and how appealing the Evox system is going to be when you've got this bigger understanding of what goes on and the process. And then if you've got issues, how rapidly you can become functional and move on compared to spending thousands and thousands of dollars over many years, whether it's drugs, which means the rest of your life, or until you go crazy and kill someone or yourself or whatever, or they lock you up away, you'll find that this is tremendous information. And it was to me, because once I saw what it was, and with the background I had in understanding all the systems, and why each of them helped to a degree, but they were catchy, and the title was catchy, and the doctor who developed them, was kind of charismatic, and so they developed followings of all these different types of therapies, but in the long run, most of them didn't get you very far, very fast. Now, eventually, some of them would have these sudden breakthroughs, and it's true. The system, after a while, would disappear if some people weren't feeling that they were getting some effects from it. So I'm not poo-pooing or downing them. I'm just saying I know a faster, simpler way that's a whole lot less expensive that can get you where you need to go, which means to become your fully functional self. Well, I picked up a little congestion, as you probably noticed. We're at the end of our discussion. So part 2 will be carrying this farther. And so what we're looking at is the relationship of the voice and the mind and Evox. And so we'll be looking for you on the next broadcast. It was nice being with you again, and I hope everything is going well with you. So till the next time, keep looking at our website, keep perusing through. We're working on some more things to go in there, and be healthy.